What's up guys, and welcome to my 4.0 updated Evernight guide. In this video I'm taking you over everything you do need to know in order to understand Evernight with a kit overview, and also how to build her with best Lightcones, Relic sets, and Planar ornaments, including the stats you want to run for her main stats and substats for both a main DPS or sub DPS roles, as the build doesn't really differentiate too much still. And then at the very end, some team building ideas for both her sub DPS role and as a main DPS. Evernight's basic attack will deal ice damage based off her max HP to a designated enemy. Her skill will consume an amount of her current HP to summon her Memo Sprite Eevee, and will increase the crit damage of the entire team's Memo Sprites by an amount equal to 24% of Evernight's crit damage for 2 turns. The duration decreases by 1 at the start of Evernight's every turn. If Eevee is already on the field, it will instead restore HP by an amount equal to 50% of its max HP, and when using this, will gain 2 points of Memoria, and if you are in the darkest riddle state, you will gain an additional 12 points of Memoria. Her ultimate will also summon her Memo Sprite Eevee, then will have Eevee deal ice damage to all enemies based off 200% of its max HP, and Evernight will enter the darkest riddle state. During this state, all enemies will take 30% increased damage, while both Evernight and Eevee will deal 60% increased damage, and will also be immune to crowd control debuffs. Gain 2 points of charge for the darkest riddle state, and Eevee will consume 1 point after it uses Dream Dissolving as due. At the start of Evernight's turn, if no charge remains, you will exit the darkest riddle state. Her talent will allow Evernight to summon her Memo Sprite Eevee at the start of the battle. Eevee will have an initial speed of 160, and the max HP of it will be equal to 50% of Evernight's. Anytime Evernight or Eevee loses HP, increases crit damage for Evernight and Eevee by 60% for 2 turns and gains 2 Memoria, and the effect can only trigger once per target for each received attack. When Evernight has 16 or more points of Memoria, dispels crowd control debuffs and becomes immune to them. If Eevee is on the field, it immediately will take action. The immediate action effect can only trigger again after Eevee uses Dream Dissolving as due. For a technique, after using it and at the start of the next battle, obtains the same effect as the one from the skill that increases crit damage for all ally Memo Sprites and will gain 1 Memoria. Onto the Memo Sprite details, the general attack is going to be automatically selecting an opponent and will prioritize the enemy target that Evernight last attacked. Will deal ice damage based off 50% of Eevee's max HP to one enemy, and for every 4 points of Memoria Evernight currently has. Additionally, deals ice damage equal to 10% of Eevee's max HP and gains a Memoria after use. The Memo Sprite talent will make it to where Eevee is immune to crowd control debuffs and will have an increased chance of being attacked, and Eevee existing on the field will make Evernight and Eevee itself deal 50% increased damage. Previously, you were hearing about the ability called Dream Dissolving as due. Dream Dissolving as due itself will be the ability being used by Evernight once she reaches 16 or higher Memoria stacks, and is not currently affected by a crowd control debuff. For every point of Memoria currently held, will deal ice damage equal to 12% of Eevee's max HP to the primary target, and ice damage equal to 6% of Eevee's max HP to other enemy targets. After use, consumes all Memoria and HP, and Eevee will disappear. Her unique enhance will be upon disappearing, increases Evernight's speed by 10%. If the disappearance is due to using Dream Dissolving as due, for every 1 Memoria point that you consumed in that attack, it will increase Evernight's speed additionally by 1%, and up to 40 Memoria points can be taken into account, and the speed boost effect will not stack and will be removed at the start of Evernight's next turn. For her traces, her A2 will increase Evernight and the Memo Sprite Eevee's crit rate by 35%. Using an ability will consume 5% of the unit's current HP to increase crit damage for both of them by 15% for 2 turns, and using Dream Dissolving as due will recover a skill point for the team. For A4, when combat starts, Evernight will regenerate 70 energy and gain a Memoria stack. When Evernight or an ally Memo Sprite uses an ability, Evernight regenerates 5 energy and gains a Memoria. And her A6 will increase the team's crit damage for Memo Sprites based on the amount of remembrance characters on the team, only being up when Evernight's skill is lasting. 1 will be 5%, 2 will be 15%, 3 will be 50%, and 4 or more will be 65%. For Eidolons, her E1 will make it to where, while Evernight is on the field, if there are 4 or more /3/2/1 enemy targets on the field, ally Memo Sprites will deal damage equal to 120%/125%/130%/150% of their original damage respectively. Her E2 will increase Evernight's and the Memo Sprite Eevee's crit damage by 40%. Each time Evernight gains a Memoria stack, increases the amount of Memoria gained by 2 points, and when using ultimate additionally will gain 2 charge for the Darkest Riddle state. Her E4 will increase all ally Memo Sprite's weakness break efficiency by 25% while Evernight is on the field, while EV itself will gain an additional 25%. Her E6 will increase everyone's all-type res pen by 20% while Evernight is on the field. After the Memo Sprite EV uses Dream Dissolving as due, Evernight will gain 30% of the Memoria consumed in this attack. Her best in slot Lightcone option actually does vary depending on her role. Overall performance as a sub-DPS and still practically just as good as a main DPS is of course none other than her own signature Lightcone, providing the wearer a 30% increase to max HP, allowing the wearer to gain a which will make damage dealt by all allies Memo Sprites ignore 20% of the target's defense, and the only condition is having the wearer's Memo Sprite use an ability, which is going to be always. Not only that, but Evernight and her Memo Sprite will get a 30% increase to damage dealt, and when the wearer's Memo Sprite disappears, the wearer will regenerate 8 energy. Everything here is both synergistic to a sub-DPS and main DPS Evernight. Regardless, as she is a HP scaler, max HP is going to be a great increase, and this providing you 30% while also having a higher base HP is very good. As I did mention, using an ability for a Memo Sprite is not going to be a problem, so it practically becomes a 20% defense ignore for the entire team's Memo Sprites, which further amplifies her sub-DPS role, but of course, it does apply herself, increasing her damage as well. Evernight doesn't have an insane amount of damage percent increases, so this 30% damage dealt increase is actually very good for both her and her Memo Sprite, allowing her to deal overall more damage, and to top it all off, anytime the wearer's Memo Sprite disappears, which will be every time you use Dream Dissolving as due, which is her whole playstyle, you will regenerate 8 energy, allowing you to cycle your ultimate more. For a sub DPS and overall Evernight, this is by far her best in slot. As a main DPS Evernight, it only loses to one option, albeit only about 5% of a difference. Of course, for main DPS Evernight, the best in slot is going to be Castrus' signature Lightcone, also providing the wearer a 30% increase to max HP, where or Memo Sprite losing HP during their own turn will give them Death Flower, allowing the wearer and the Memo Sprite to ignore 30% of the target's defense when dealing damage for 2 turns, and when the wearer's Memo Sprite disappears, advances the wearer's action by 12% and can trigger one time, and the trigger count is reset every ultimate. The reason this is better for main DPS Evernight is relatively simple, just because it has the same max HP increase, but the base HP of this Lightcone is actually higher. Not only that, but the defense ignore is rather not being applied to everyone's Memo Sprite and being applied to the wearer and the Memo Sprite only this time, which isn't really a difference just because Evernight's own signature also applies to herself, but it is 30% rather than 20%. So instead of giving the entire team's Memo Sprites 20% defense ignore, rather Evernight and EV itself are going to be getting 30% defense ignore. On top of that, 12% action advance when the wearer's Memo Sprite disappears, which is quite synergistic to her speed percent buff in her base kit. Only problem is you're only able to do it once every ultimate, and she's not going to get her ultimate an insane amount of times to get this constantly, so it's not something you're going to see an immense amount of times. But for overall damage output, it is going to be her best if you are running her as a main DPS. The Battle Pass Lightcone The Flower Remembers is also insanely good, providing a 24% increase to the wearer's crit damage, and the crit damage dealt by the wearer's Memo Sprite will increase by 24%, and at S5, the value for the crit damage for the wearer is 40%, while the crit damage for the Memo Sprite becomes 48%. So 40% for Evernight herself, which of course impacts her Memo Sprite, and then for the Memo Sprite itself, it's going to also get an additional 48%. So for the main source of damage being Dream Dissolving as due, that is going to be getting a significant increase, while Evernight's ultimate and such still does get an increase with 40% crit damage. This would be her best 4-star option if you do have it, but one that can perform similarly, only has a problem with overcapping crit rate, is Sweat Now, Cry Less, providing a 12% increase to the wearer's crit rate. When the wearer's Memo Sprite is on the field, it increases the damage dealt by the wearer and the Memo Sprite by 24%. Evernight not only has the 5% base crit rate that every character has, her traces provide her 18.7% crit rate, and her actual bonus trace provides 35% crit rate. This makes it a lot easier to overcap because at S5 it's 20% crit rate with 36% damage dealt for the wearer and Memo Sprite. Although you could adjust your build to mainly focus on just HP percent and crit damage, because this is also providing you a significant amount of crit rate. But if you are running this, the goal is to try to get less crit rate on your rolls and focus more on others, just because you don't want to overcap. While it's fine if you overcap a bit, if a lot of your crit rate is focused on overcapping, like 10% plus, unfortunately it's going to be a good amount of wasted stats that you could have had elsewhere. But it still makes this Lightcone a very solid option, as it does provide more crit rate for your build, which, as I mentioned, lets you focus on other stats, while EV and Evernight herself gets a 36% increase to damage dealt, You'd think maybe with the recycling playstyle this is a bit of a problem, but every time you use Dream Dissolving as do, Evernight's Memo Sprite is on the field, so that attack would be getting the 36% increase to damage dealt. So for any time it does matter, it will be active. Unfortunately, those are the only options you want to use for ones that do work. The only other option is the story's next page, not for the second part of the effect, but for the increases the wearer's max HP by 16%. At S5, it's 32%. She doesn't heal, so this entire part is useless. It's just for the max HP increase. This is better than running a high base HP Lightcone, as it's providing you a big increase to max HP. So if you have none of the options I mentioned, no signatures, or the Battle Pass Lightcones, then this would be what you have to do. However, if you are also missing that, the next thing you can do is, as I mentioned, running a high base HP Lightcone. All you have to do is go to your Lightcone sections, go to the sorting rule, disable this so you can actually change it, and select HP. Once you select it here, first it will show you the compatible with the character's paths, which would of course be the Remembrance Lightcones, and here it would be incompatible, but the entire point here is to pick the Lightcone with the highest base HP for you to use. Of course, there are some signatures as you see here that have higher base HP than the actual Lightcones for standard. Just pick whatever option you are not using. Let's say maybe you have a Blade and Blade signature Lightcone, but he is unused. In that case, you can put it on her instead. For Evernight's Relic sets, there is only one option you want to run 4-piece wise, either as a main DPS or sub DPS, and that is World Remaking Deliverer. 2-piece provides 8% crit rate, 4-piece after wearer uses basic attack or skill. If the wearer's Memo Sprite is on the field, increases max HP of the wearer and their Memo Sprite by 24%. It will also increase all allies damage dealt by 15%, lasting until the next use of a basic attack or skill by the wearer. Depending on your build, 2-piece providing 8% crit rate can be helpful, and it also eases the amount of crit rate you would need in your actual relics. But the 4-piece provides the wearer and the Memo Sprite themselves 24% max HP, while also providing 15% damage dealt for the team, which also includes Evernight. So effectively, if you're running her as a main DPS and focusing on her damage, she's getting 24% max HP and 15% damage dealt, and as a sub DPS, the entire team is getting 15% damage dealt. Regardless of her role, this is going to be the set that outperforms any other. If you are unfortunately struggling to have a 4-piece or you're still farming for one, if you need a 2-piece combination, it would be 2-piece crit with 2-piece crit or 2-piece crit with 2-piece HP. That would mean 2-piece World Remaking Deliverer or Scholar, as they both have the same 2-piece crit rate, alongside 2-piece Wave Strider for 16% crit damage. Take any of those combinations. If you need more crit rate, of course I'd go to these. If you need the crit damage, then that, and combine that with 2-piece Longevious as well for 12% max HP. You can also combine any of those with 2-piece of the ice damage set as well, which would be Glacial Forest. And for Planar Ornaments, there are 2 sets you can run. For simplicity's sake and still performance being just as good, if not sometimes better depending on your actual roles, Bone Set is going to be the most common. 12% max HP for the wearer, and when the wearer's max HP is 5,000 or higher, increases the wearer's and their Memo Sprite's crit damage by 28%. 12% max HP is going to be good for her damage as she scales off max HP. 5,000 or higher max HP is not going to be a problem whatsoever, so it becomes a free 28% crit damage for both Evernight and Eevee. This set will always outperform the other set as a sub DPS Evernight, but even for a main DPS, the difference between this set and the next set is very minuscule, roughly about 1 to 2%. Bone Set is also just going to be the most consistent because the other one is a bit more restrictive, and so overall Bone Set is going to be the go-to, but you can run the Arcadia of Woven Dreams, which when the number of allied targets on the field is not equal to 4, for every 1 additional or missing allied target, increases the damage dealt by the wearer and the Memo Sprite by 9/12%, stacking up to 4/3 times. So instead of providing any form of HP and crit damage, it gives you a lot more damage dealt. This is worse for sub DPS Evernight, as mainly for someone like Castris, where Castris wants high HP on her teammates to build more new blood. This doesn't provide any max HP, so for sub DPS Evernight, it is worse. However, for main DPS, it can perform just as good Bone, if not slightly better, as I did mention. Although you would need the full requirements, so everyone on the team has to have a Memo Sprite, so you can actually get the full effect. Missing 1 stack is going to make it perform worse than Bone overall. For the main stats on the relics, for the body, you are going to run crit damage, as you really have no reason to run a crit rate body as she has so many crit rate sources. For the feet, you want to run HP %. For the orb, you can do either HP % as a sub DPS for Castris, or if you are running main DPS, you want to run ice damage. However, even as a main DPS, if you are running the Arcadia Planar Ornament, in that case you can also run HP %. The difference is not going to be that big. But for most people running Bone, if you are running her alongside Castris, you want to run HP % for more new blood generation. But for better Evernight personal damage, ice damage is the orb you want to run. And for the link rope, you want HP %. With the substats, you are just focusing on crit rate, crit damage, HP percent, and I'll talk a little bit about speed in a minute. For HP in general, getting it to around 7,000 or higher is going to be your goal. That is a healthy range for Evernight. Of course, if you are running an HP orb and such, and also a Lightcone that increases HP, which would be one of the signatures or the story's next page, in that case, aiming closer to 8,000 or higher for casters to generate more new blood is ideal. For crit rate, the maximum you need on Evernight before battle is 65%, as her trace gives 35%. Having 65% would mean having 100% in battle. Of course, if you are running a main DPS Evernight alongside RMC on the team, you would only need 55%, just so you can account for the 10% crit rate that RMC provides. With 55% crit rate going into battle and being buffed by RMC would be 65% crit rate, then her trace also being active gives you 100%. For crit damage, ideally you want to get it as high as possible, as she is able to increase the team's Memo Sprite's crit damage based off her own. But roughly having around 190% or higher is a good amount of crit damage to hold. As I mentioned, for speed specifically, this is something you can slightly adjust depending on what you want to do. If you remember, when EB disappears, Evernight is able to get a speed increase that also gets further by the amount of Memoria stack she does consume. Consuming 40 points of Memoria will make it to where you will get a total of a 50% increase to speed, which without speed rolls allows you to reach 148.5 speed in battle. If you want to account for maximum efficiency and reach hyperspeed with a Evernight with every buff active, aim to get a total of 12.5 speed rolls as substats, meaning you would need roughly about 112 speed to get the full hyperspeed effect. However, for a E0 Evernight, that might prove to be a bit difficult, so a more safer amount to go for would be around 120, just so you don't have to get the full effect every time of the actual speed percent bonus. But this is just fine-tuning if you really want to get those extra turns, hit hyperspeed and such. That is the only time you do it. For the most part, you don't really have to focus on it, as she is able to hit breakpoint with consuming enough Memoria on her own without speed rolls. And of course, finally, the team building section. Team building for Evernight is relatively basic. First, let's start it off for the Sub-DPS as Castress. So of course, Evernight is going to be on the team, and also Castress is going to be on the team as well, as that is the primary Sub-DPS role she does have. The third slot is usually going to always go to Hyacine, even for main DPS or Sub-DPS Evernight doesn't need Hyacine just as much as Castress does. Castress is a character who really wants her, but regardless, Hyacine is going to be best in slot for both roles. And then the last slot on this team would go to none other than Cyrene. But if you do not have Cyrene, of course, you can just use Tribi in that slot instead. If you don't have Tribi either, then you can also use someone else that might be a bit less for team damage, such as RMC. You can also use a debuffer like Cypher to provide a form of damage and for the team. But for this, I'm just going to put Cyrene here to show you the best Castress and Evernight team. And then of course, for sustain, sub out for who you do have. If you have Luocha in this case, Gallagher, so on and so forth. Whatever healer that has the best healing output, that is going to be the option you want to run. Now for main DPS Evernight, this is a bit more flexible, but really the only thing you're removing here is the equation of Castress. The best in slot team relatively would remain the same. It's going to be these two for best output, and the last slot would usually go to RMC. So the best hyper carry team for Evernight would be this team right here. And as per usual, you would sub out accordingly. If you don't have the ability to use RMC, maybe they're taken up, you can also very much use Tribi in that sense as well. Cypher also does work for damage amp, as their debuffs are good for the team. Same thing would apply to someone like Silverwolf. For healers, just like I mentioned with the Castress team, run your best healer with the best healing output. You don't need the best healing output totally in a sense for this team, just because you're not generating new blood, so the amount of healing isn't the actual point that matters. You just want to be sustained well. And substitutes for Cyrene would be similar to the ones I mentioned with RMC, again, Tribi or a debuffer like Cypher or Silverwolf. But with Evernight, you can also use other characters that do have a form of good buffs for her, being someone like Ruan Mei. That brings us to the end of the full 4.0 updated Evernight guide. I do hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to my channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for future videos like this, along with all other types of Star Wars content, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.